Okay. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Tracy McIntyre, my colleague, is trying to log in. She's having internet trouble. So that, tends to happen a lot. But my name is Rachel Moses. I'm collections manager. I'm Pry House manager. And oh, sorry. I'm admitting people and trying to talk. I'm not very good at multitasking. But thank you everybody for joining. We have a good crowd, which is great. Oh, here comes Tracy.
Okay, take it easy. Bye-bye.
Okay. I am so sorry. A lot of people are tuning in, so
Hi there.
there's Tracy. Tracy, could you take over for a minute? I'm gonna just let people in, and I'm
Okay.
not doing a good job multitasking. So
Okay. Hi, Carol. I see you're on.
Hi, Tracy. Thank you guys for inviting me. I'm really thrilled.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Glad to have you on board here. I apologize for logging in a little late. I'm having internet issues here. I don't know. I think the heat might be affecting my internet provider. It's a little bit wonky today. Is it hot where you are?
Oh, it's hot where I am. It's actually I just looked at my phone before I shut it off. It was 95 or 96 degrees with a 105 feel.
That's about what it is here too.
Is
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
You're south of us.
Yeah. We're Western Maryland, but yeah, it's been brutal the past few days, and I guess it's going to continue. So everybody, I'm really happy to introduce. This is Carol Adrian. She is the author of Healing a Divided Nation, and she will be joining us for our discussion this evening about her wonderful book. So we'll just wait for Rachel to let everybody on, and then we'll get started.
I can't believe how many people are here.
We usually have a good following here. We've got some loyal folks that show up to every single meeting, and then every once in a while we get some new folks too. So it's nice to see everybody.
This is actually my very first book club meeting of any sort, even though I've been a voracious reader since I could read. And I know people and I'll read books, but I've never been to a book club meeting. So
well,
ready to take notes.
Welcome. That's great. That's great. We're happy to have you. Happy to have everybody. Rachel, you still have a bunch of people to let on? Oh, maybe. All right. Well, I suppose we can get the discussion started anyway, and I guess we'll just open it with what did everybody think of Carol's book? Got some comments?
I thought it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. I have been before I moved to Colorado, I was a volunteer at Manassas National Battlefield Park, and I was particularly struck by the parts that you were reporting on amputations, because just a few years ago, in putting in apparently a new electrical line, they came across a complete cadaver and one that was incomplete, missing its head. And next to that was a limb pit or a bone pit. And they were able to trace the two unknown soldiers.
Whoa.
Because the cuts made by the surgeon in the amputations were very specific to one surgeon. So they were able to trace it to I think it was the 10th New York. And by using some kind of mineral tracing, were then able to trace these two soldiers to within the area around Plattsburgh, New York. So the amputations were apparently very specific per surgeon. Some of them obviously more skilled than others, but the cuts on this one were were why they were able to identify these two soldiers, which were subsequently reinterred in Arlington National Cemetery.
Was it because of what they left as a flap that they were able to tell?
Say again, I'm not.
It was a new technique really devised at the time of the war, where they discovered if you left a certain flap of skin, it was easier to prepare for the eventual prosthetic limb.
Well, there wouldn't have been any skin left on this. This was the
Oh.
way that the cut was made. And apparently there was something about the angulation of it and the ridges that were in it that identified this particular surgeon with the New York 10th.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to Google where was it? What
This was at Manassas National Battlefield Park.
Oh,
And I'm going to say it's probably been, maybe it's close to 10 years ago now. And there was a huge ceremony. I mean, there was a caissons and, the Army came out, and it got to be a little touchy because it was the Park Service versus the Smithsonian versus the Army, because the Army, because these were unidentified, laid claim to these soldiers. So the Smithsonian wanted, their piece of it, the Park Service wanted their piece of it, and it got to be a little messy, but in the end, they were reinterred, and they were reinterred in a part of the cemetery, Arlington Cemetery, that had not yet been used. So they were the first two to go in. And because they could not conclusively identify the bodies and therefore did not let family members know, they were both buried as unknowns, even though they had their suspicions of who these people were.
Wow.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
It
That's
was
amazing.
fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating. It was really amazing. And to this day, no one is allowed to know where they dug that up, because they think that there'll be too many people that would go over there with metal detectors and all kinds of other things, even though that's illegal on national park property. But they just didn't want people poking around there, because there could be more. They could find more there, because there were a lot of dead bodies in Manassas. And this one was from the Second Battle of Manassas, not the first.
If you check out in the chat, Arian Bostian found a link to the story.
Yeah,
I
it's a
think-
great story. It's a great story. Yeah.
I
And
think-
all we know is that it's in the western part of the park, because that was where the second battle took place. The first battle was more on the eastern part of the park.
I
Very
think
cool.
that this is one of the strengths of a group like this, that you hear and learn of anecdotes like this. I mean, I did not know about this, and I live in Alexandria, Virginia, and I just love the strength that comes from something like this. Thank you.
Indeed.
Yes,
you
thanks
could-
for sharing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I live in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and I remember when that story came out in the Washington Post. It was very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
Well,
So
everybody should
anybody
go
else
see
have any
Manassas Battlefield.
thoughts on Carol's book?
Yeah, Susan had her hand up, so I'll go after her.
Hi, Jim. Hi, everyone. Hi, Carol.
hey.
Thank you for
Hey.
being here. I loved your book.
Oh,
It moved so quickly. It was like from one topic to the next, and I couldn't put it down. You also had a shout out to the National Museum of Civil War, history. So it was wonderful. But in your
thank you.
introduction, I actually, I always take some notes, but in your introduction, it was a wonderful overview, and I learned so much. But you had mentioned about some prison camps, and you said that there was a camp in Chicago, a prison camp called Camp Douglas, that was
Mm.
comparable to Andersonville. I live in Chicago. I have never heard of it. Never. So I got sidetracked from your book and I had to go read up on all this stuff. It's down by the University of Chicago. I read so much. But you really covered everything from
Oh,
venereal diseases to like opium and the old soldiers disease and addiction, which I kind of specialize in some of that here in Chicago. I was fascinated with that. Prosthetics, horses, vet care, dental issues. I was fascinated with Gatling, plastic surgery,
Oh.
dental devices, you name it. The Geneva Convention. And the one part I did, the part that it was very grisly for me to read was the autopsy report that you wrote, that you found and put in the book from Abraham Lincoln. That was, I mean, it was fascinating, but it was grim, you know? So your research and everything was phenomenal. And I really learned a lot. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was, yeah, you get into that and you go down so many rabbit holes. It's, I was rereading my own book I thought I better be ready. I haven't read it in over a year. And I was Googling in the middle of, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot. And then it's just a multifaceted smorgasbord of information, that whole area.
Yeah.
Wow.
And what I like about this book is it covers every single thing that we talk about in our museum. I mean, it literally should be the guidebook for all of our museum employees and volunteers, because it literally covers everything that we talk about, and it's great.
Thank you.
If I could
James,
just comment on, I just wanted to comment on the Lincoln autopsy. There's at the National Portrait Gallery, there's a photograph of Lincoln that was taken by Andrew Gardner, and it was taken just before he was killed. And subsequent to taking that photograph, the glass plate was dropped. And so there's a crack in the glass plate, which apparently is the same trajectory as the bullet that killed him, which was just one of those quirky little things that somebody found out.
wow.
On the photograph on the glass plate,
It's on the glass plate. The glass plate was dropped before the photograph could be printed. It was I'm not familiar enough with photography to be able to, speak eloquently on that, but the impression was made on the glass plate. The glass plate was then used to make the print. The glass plate was dropped, and it was the trajectory of the bullet that killed Lincoln.
wow.
So another place to check out is the National Portrait Gallery.
There
we go. I think Dr. Lett has a question or a comment. You had your hand up.
Well, thanks, Tracy. One of each. Thank you, Carol, if I may call you that. Your book was amazing to me in that whether you were a novice in Civil War and Civil War medicine history, or you thought you were fairly advanced, which is where I thought I was, there was something for all of us. I was really amazed. Was that your intent, or is that just how the book came out?
I'll tell you, it was very odd, but since we already talked about like that glass plate, that was odd too. I had no intention of working on the field of Civil War medicine. I was researching something else at the time. And when I stumbled on the story of it, and I thought, somebody must have done this. This is incredible. Like, I've never seen anything about it. And the more I looked, I thought, no one's really done an intensive, I mean, people have written clinical things, but I was very upset because I thought, this is not my subject. I felt after a while, to use an old-fashioned word, I felt the story had been vouchsafed to me. And I felt an obligation to tell it. And once I realized like the people I was reading about and what they did, it just grabs you by the throat. And so I did, although I was not an experienced researcher in that area by any means, I spent almost the next 5 years reviewing primary source documents from, I'd have to go back and count, but literally dozens of institutions to put that story together. So it's amazing sometimes where things take you, but it was just impossible to say no to. But somebody's got to do it.
Yeah,
We're glad you did.
Yep.
my second part of that comment is early on, you wrote about Abraham Lincoln and his experience with mercury and how he was so depressed using the mercury. He had behavioral changes that he even grabbed, I think, one of the legislators when he was president by the vest or the throat, and then stopped taking mercury, and those things seemed to resolve. I had never heard that before. I would love to know more about what you found out about that and the sources for it.
Could I just comment? Could I throw something in there
please,
too, though?
please.
One of the things that has never really come out about Abraham Lincoln is that he had Marfan syndrome. And Marfan syndrome is why he had such long arms and long legs. But one of the pathologies associated with Marfan syndrome is also psychological problems that are fairly wide ranging, but depression is one of the problems that occurs with Marfan syndrome. And his melancholic states, as has always been associated with him, are very much associated with Marfan syndrome. So it could be the mercury, or it could just be the physiology of that syndrome.
There's a second disease that's suspected, a genetic. I'm just looking, neoplasia type. Oh, I'm sorry, I have the Cliff Notes, but sorry, I have to go back. I think it's probably, well, I won't waste your time looking, but neoplasia type B or something. There's disagreement in the medical community about whether it was Marfan's or this other, but he was taking blue pills, blue mass, mercurous chloride is like a clay-like thing. And you're right, depression is a side effect of both that disease and of consumption of blue mass. But he apparently, he took, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It looks like Lester's iPhone is not muted.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
But he suffered from constipation and depression, and his family actually, the depression seemed to go back generations. That the Lincolns were always kind of known for that. But he said that his words that I found, when he stopped taking them, he said those pills made him cross. So that could be depression or anger or something like that.
Carol, you just muted yourself.
Sorry. The information came in pieces. I read so many doctors' memoirs, and even people who really had not even treated Lincoln commented on it from that time period. So I put it together from those pieces. I really relied on primary source. And I realized too, when somebody's recollecting, you don't know if it's 100% or it's been colored by time, or environment or anything, but that it did come over several different comments by medical professionals of the period.
Thank you.
He did say he felt better after.
If I could ask one more question too, Carol, you mentioned Dr. Mary Walker toward the end, and I was just kind of curious as to why she didn't play a more important role. I mean, she's the only woman that ever got the Medal of Honor, and then it was taken from her, and it was only given back like, many years after she died. And I mean, she may not have, been as flamboyant as the Blackwell sisters, but she did end
as
up
cranky.
becoming the head of surgery in Tennessee, and had a pretty well-established career, even though the Army was a little bit reluctant about allowing her to be part of their team, but she did play her part.
She did, and I think both she and the Blackwell sisters were not people who took no for an answer easily. But it was interesting because I spent quite a lot of time there's an awful lot been written about Dr. Mary Walker, that she dressed as a man, and she was married and was this, was that. She served as a scout and a spy. She was captured and held behind enemy lines. And a couple things I read said that the Confederates had such a tough time with her that they pretty much gave her back.
Wanted to get rid of her.
I can't validate that. But one thing that I was not able to find, took me a long time to find from whence she had graduated medical school, because she did have an MD, which was very unusual.
From
Syracuse.
Yeah.
So I did find that, but I could not find any firsthand writings or knowledge about her actual actions, her medical treatments, her, anything that she recommended. There was a surprising dearth. I got all excited because in the collection of Library Company of Philadelphia, I think, not the Free Library, there's a manuscript, an unpublished manuscript that a graduate student had written about her. And I got all excited because I thought maybe, this person, but it was pretty much of a blank on those points.
That's interesting, because they're really, even at the is it the Women in the Army Museum or something like that over at Arlington Cemetery? There's a little place that is specific for women who have served in the Army, and they have a full-length portrait of her there. They mention her, but as you said, I have not really been able to find very much on what her techniques were, or what her specialties were, or what her interest was. She seemed to just kind of coast through, but made an impression enough to get a Medal of Honor.
Well, I think too, they really honored her work as a scout and spy, as well as her medical contribution. It seemed to me that there was a lot of respect there for that. But there's something about her story that's missing. But I will tell you, every time I lecture, I manage to work in that she is the only woman ever to have received, to this date, in the year 2024, the Medal of Honor. So
Now, we had one of our books that we had in the book club in the past was it Dr. Walker's Civil War, Rachel?
Yes.
Yeah, yes, that's
Yes.
right. And by Teresa Kaminsky. And we had Teresa Kaminsky come on and speak. So I think that I know she's done a lot of research as well on Dr. Walker, but even in that book, as extensive as it was, you're right. There's no information as to, the way she treated her patients or what she recommended or anything else. I think that book, if I remember correctly, concentrates more on her women's rights sort of issues, and it's kind of light on the Civil War aspect.
Yeah, it was. I remember that. Yeah.
One of the things that I was struck by too was, you focused on all of the new innovations that came into the medical community and especially the service medical community because of the war. And it seems like that's true of every war. I mean, in Vietnam, they developed crazy glue because they wanted to use it instead of sutures, which, didn't work. But, I look at that now and where there was a focus on, what they were calling nervous diseases, even back in the Civil War. And then there was, shell shock during the First and Second World Wars, and now we have PTSD. And, VA really hasn't picked up on that. They still have not moved forward. I mean, you walk around DC and, so many of the homeless are indeed veterans who have not been treated. And I just still wonder if that's just still an area that's still a little bit too baffling for something like the Army to take on. You're muted again, Carol.
Sorry, I'm not sure how I'm doing that, but that is pretty amazing. I mean, it goes back to some of the terms they were using, nostalgia,
Mm-hmm.
and plus all those separate terms they used for women, with depression or
Hysteria.
yeah. But wow, I didn't realize that there hadn't been contemporary work on PTSD. I mean, it's you hear the term so commonly, but I honestly didn't realize whether there was anything new behind it.
As far as I know, the VA has really not, there's no research that the VA is doing. I'm pretty sure of that. And the treatments that people with PTSD are getting, I think are pretty surface. I think they're pretty superficial. I don't think that it's been delved into the way that I feel it could be at this point in time with such a variety of techniques available, whether it's, traditional with pharmacology or whether it's, spirituality or whatever. It just seems like there should be a lot more ways to treat something like that, since it follows every single war that's been around. I'm sure it's been going on since, Greek and Roman times.
But how could you not witness that kind of traumatic, horrendous activity and not be affected by it? Because they've even done, I think, some studies because they treat service dogs with PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
So, but not our soldiers. So.
Yeah.
Ooh.
And part of it might be too that, the people who are experiencing PTSD might not be focused on a treatment for it, because when you get caught up in that kind of mental disability, you're not thinking, oh, I need to get better. You're just thinking, I need to survive. And so many of them may not even be trying to seek out help, and that might be part of it too. But it just seems like that's a big area that is still left in the void.
Yeah, I think you're right. I know it, and again, it's there's a stigma attached to
Yeah.
unfortunately any mental illness, to show a weakness. And I know in the 19th century, it was considered, you had a weak constitution, or your resolve was too weak, or you weren't brave or whatever. I mean, there are all these negative connotations to having, melancholia or soldier's heart or whatever it was that they wanted to call it. And I'm sure there was so many soldiers that suffered from that just kept it to themselves. And I'm just wondering, how much that goes on still to this day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does. Yeah, it's
Very
just,
good.
it's so
You think
sad.
that so many of them just went back to farms and that we did not have the communication that we have now? So I'm sure there was a lot of it, but I mean, it wasn't well known throughout the country, maybe in big cities or whatever. but I would suspect that it would also add the cultural taboo about it to the isolation of it, and I'm sure a lot of it was just ignored.
Yeah, agreed.
Kind of interesting because the whole there was a label of feminization attached to the loss of a limb.
Mm.
And there really was heavy stigma attached to that. And then when there were thousands of people, I think Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote about that there's basically no family we know who has not, either lost someone or someone has lost a limb from it. And they really had to, they say, to give the appearance beneath the chandeliers of health. And so that was one big cultural thing that had to flip. I mean, they had to accept that about men coming back from the war. I don't think it became, it was more normalized, but it's kind of interesting that that was dealt with more specifically than the mental repercussions.
Well, there's the whole idea of the empty sleeve. And I know when I was doing some research on prosthetics and things, some of the Civil War soldiers actually refused to wear a prosthetic because they felt that the empty sleeve gave them more status as a veteran to show off their wound rather than to try to hide it with a prosthetic.
I've found some sheet music, more than one, written about the empty sleeve.
Mm.
Uh,
I was also curious about the dentistry. Did the Confederacy like did they like the idea of keeping their teeth healthy that much more? Was it only because Jefferson Davis was so into it? But I mean, that seemed a little bizarre to me that all of the Confederate soldiers are going around with toothbrushes. I mean, it just seemed really weird.
No, you're right. The Union gave the Union did not supply toothbrushes. It was like, bring your own toothbrush. But interestingly, because they would, they would get knocked out of action by dental eruptions. And the Confederates, who had 9,000, soldiers compared to.
You're muted again. Carol, you're muted again.
On my keyboard, I'm sorry. The Confederacy, they could not afford to have men down and out because of dental problems. Am I?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
You're good.
And so they had dentists assigned to all these different regiments. And the Union, although there were people who really campaigned to the Army saying, we need dentists in there, and the Union never capitulated to that. But it was pretty much a fix them up, get them back on the battlefield issue, as I interpreted it, than something where they held it high, high esteem or related it to Jefferson Davis. It really was a very practical kind of thing. But those dentists, who once they were in the Army, now they're surgeons for the most part. So yeah, it was but although the dentists, thank God, brought anesthesia in. The Thomas Green Morton, Thomas Green William Morton, the dentist who did all the experimentation and failed to receive any real plaudits or money or fame from it in his lifetime, died very young and frustrated in his 40s. But he had experimented with it on himself, his pet Cocker Spaniel, a hen, and a goldfish, and everybody recovered. And they really brought anesthesia into the Civil War. The College of Physicians of Philadelphia here is where the first paper was presented in 1847 from the dentists about the use of anesthesia. So I can't imagine a war that went down before that where that wasn't available. but some of them, like Dr. Morton, he was really well known for, he would go out on the battlefields after a battle and administer ether to the guys lying there waiting for rescue to give them a window from pain. It really only gave them about a 9-minute window during surgery. So they got pretty fast.
Yeah, but that's most of the amputations were done within 10 to 15 minutes.
Mhm.
Because of that, yeah.
Yeah. There's also a thing there's a common misperception. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the late Dr. Alfred J. Bullitt, who wrote what I think is one of the best books ever written, Civil War Medicine, Triumphs and Challenges. He was a professor of clinical medicine at Yale for many years. And he explained to me about second stage anesthesia, because you read these things about guys on the operating tables outside and thrashing and, you know, as if they were doing the operation without anesthesia. But the numbers look like almost every surgery had anesthesia, and both sides had it throughout the war. You know, not a lot. And the Confederates, even when it got pretty light, that's when Dr. Chisholm invented the Chisholm inhaler, which used far less chloroform than soaking a cloth. So it got them through the war with it. But yeah, there's a memorial to Dr. Morton. In fact, there was a book and a movie, Freedom from Pain. I have to look. It's in my book. I'm sorry. I always forget stuff before the test. But that he took pain out of surgery. Pretty important finding.
Was chloroform one of the things that became problematic because of the blockades?
Everything became problematic because of the blockades. The thing that they seem to have suffered the worst over was quinine. Yeah,
There was a story that I heard. There was actually a book that I read. It was about mosquitoes, and I can't remember the name of the book. It may have just been Mosquito, but basically this author determined that every war that was ever fought in the history of the world could have been won or lost because of mosquitoes. But he was stating how when Grant marched on Vicksburg, that the blockade at New Orleans prevented quinine from getting to both the people and the troops, the Confederate troops that were in Vicksburg, and that Grant's soldiers all had quinine so they could march through the swamps, get to Vicksburg, have the siege of Vicksburg, and that the people were so weakened by malaria from the mosquitoes as well as no food, that's basically how Grant won Vicksburg. That it was not really a glorious defeat by a miraculously, a miraculous army that came through and slaughtered everybody, that it was nature taking its course in Vicksburg, and Grant just happened to be there and managed to get the credit for it.
Oh, I didn't
Wow.
know that.
I've never heard that. That's cool.
I'm going
Was-
down that rabbit
I'm pretty
hole
sure
later.
the book is, I'm pretty sure the book is called Mosquito. And I mean, it was really fascinating. I mean, he even thinks that the dinosaurs died because of mosquitoes. So,
Wow.
I know
It
there's
may be-
a book called Mosquito Soldiers. I don't know if that's the one you're thinking about or not.
no, that's not, that,
Okay.
this wasn't about soldiers. This was basically about mosquitoes.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find the name of that for
Yeah.
future reference.
Guys are sending me back to the drawing board.
Well, you sent us to the drawing board too. There were so many things that I kept looking at here and thinking, oh, I wish I knew more about that. One of the things that that I was wondering about too was Sherman's bow ties, because the railroads played such an important part, and when Sherman marched through, I mean, he really upended all of the railroads through the South. And, you know, the way that they tied them up, they called them Sherman's bow ties. And that was something that I think played as much a part in why when Sherman got to the sea and presented Savannah as a Christmas present to Abraham Lincoln, that really, in addition to burning half of the South through there, that was a big way that the South was really decimated because they lost so much of their ability to move what little they had around.
And I know this,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, I know the South had issues with their railroad anyway, because they didn't have a standard gauge system for
Right.
their railroads. And so, you know, you send a train from, you know, Manassas to, I don't know, to
Richmond.
Georgia or something, you know, sometimes they have to change tracks. And so it was a mess already because of the lack of standardized gauging. But I'm sure that I know Sherman contributed to destroying what was in Georgia anyway.
Somebody presented to me as a metaphor that if as a kid, if you knew model trains, he said it was like having Lionels and HOs, and they're completely different scale. And so once you got to the end of the Lionel, you had to like get on a different train. I mean, they couldn't go all the way through on one train, but the
Right.
North used a consistent gauge.
Right.
Yeah.
I like
Carol,
your, oh, sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, I don't want to take us off the book, but Carol, when I was reading about you, it mentioned that you were working on a series about the Civil War to be presented in the future. So maybe after you answer Susan's questions, you'd tell us more about that plan.
Oh, sure. But you know, I'm listening so hard because I thought I'm curious to see what spoke to you guys who are knowledgeable. You know, you're not just coming from nowhere. And I thought the stuff that really grabbed you or fascinated you, because we're still working on the series, and I'll be happy to answer that question. But let me find out what was Susan's comment.
Oh,
or
no,
question.
I was just gonna say, well, I was just gonna say that with regards to Sherman, for some reason, I'm just not a Sherman fan, but, and, but it was interesting the way you went into, you know, guns and ammo and gunpowder and the Spencer, Remington, you know, I found that fascinating. Uh, just how more sophisticated the weapons became. Obviously the medical had to keep up with that, and that's, you know, it's the way it had to be. And Gatling, he seems like it would be a mad scientist, but he was all over the place with his Gatling gun, but he was a medical doctor.
Yes.
But Sherman said something that jumped out at me, and it was about the landmines. I think you had a quote in there from him.
Weapons
And
that
I
really-
had no idea that they had landmines back in the Civil War. I mean, you know, basically Sherman said that that wasn't fair, and that landmines weren't war, it was murder. And I'm
Yes.
like, you know, that's the pot calling the kettle black, but I don't know. That's neither here nor there. So
That was one of the things that really grabbed me when I was doing the research, because I thought, wait a minute, landmines, that's like Princess Diana, you know, territory in my head. I thought they had landmines, and they did. And there were some powerful letters written about, you know, this is not war, this is murder. But they also, I didn't realize that they had gotten so sophisticated with electricity that they had floating mines in the water that could be operated remotely with electricity. But you could wait, like if something went by that wasn't a valuable target, you could let it go. But if, you know, an incoming ship was an enemy ship, you could smack the button and blow it up with those. And I was, you know, I just didn't think about it. torpedoes. I mean, they had really, the technology of weapons was astounding.
Yeah, those mines that you're talking about with that were triggered electronically, they were called torpedoes back then. And that phrase about damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, those are the kind of torpedoes that they're talking about, the mines that were laid in Mobile Bay, in the harbor area. It wasn't the torpedo that we think about that's coming out of the submarine. But what he was referring to was those type of torpedoes, what we today would call mines.
I think that whole section on the weaponry struck me as we're very good at figuring out how to make things better at killing each other, and it's just an ongoing, like, it's so sad, that every war, it's just something we do, we just keep making weaponry that's more, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, more capable of hurting other people. It's, I don't know, it's odd to me. The other thing I wanted to say while I have my turn here is that I was really struck by your paragraph about the Civil War. The concept of contagion of diseases being spread from one person to another was somewhat uncertain. So, but even though that they did have the quarantines, but it really was a political issue. And so, we just keep repeating these same mistakes. I was at a homestead, a historical homestead, and one of the houses there was the plague house from like the 1900s. And it was the same thing where there was the whole political part of keeping the people with smallpox in the plague house. They couldn't be released until they were declared safe by the government officer. And but it was also a political issue then, and we just keep repeating these same mistakes over and over and over again. So and it's so much political issue rather than what's best for the whole community. So that struck me quite a bit.
Right. It really, yeah, because the business owners would get upset about it if the quarantines and hello.
Yeah. And that was certainly an issue 3 years ago. It was an issue in this 1900s homestead. I mean, it just, where our priorities are, I guess.
Well, I think vaccines also fit into that category.
Sure.
As you were stating in the book, there were people who thought that vaccines were terrible, and now we still do. People still don't understand the science behind vaccines and how imperative it is to protect yourself from things that are going to kill you unless unless your body knows how to take care of it. But I think that so few people understand, first of all, don't understand human anatomy, but second, don't understand the immune system and how it works, so that their ignorance is what makes people so reticent about getting a vaccine.
I have a question for you guys. Were you familiar with, in terms of vaccine, the smallpox inoculation? Were you familiar with the Onesimus and Cotton Mather story from Boston?
Yeah.
I that had been new.
I
to
was
me.
not, no.
No.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah.
I had heard of it, but not in a lot of detail, having grown up in Massachusetts and being immersed in Massachusetts history. I had heard of it, but I didn't know all the details. So it was really nice to have it fleshed out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought when good things happen, right?
Mhm.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot of us, and I'm one of them, is we get a little confused between vaccination and inoculation
Mm.
around
Mhm.
smallpox. And that is something that might be something for you to bring forth as you do this next series.
Oh, that is interesting. Wait, gotta make a note, or if I mute myself.
The other thing that amazed me, and maybe that's something you can think about bringing forth, is getting back to Martha's comments, is why is it our ability to kill people with innovation is always far advanced to the ability to fix them
Well, you said
after
that
these
so
new
much better.
devices. And it's stunning to me that it seems like medicine has a lag period of 5 to 10 years after innovations occur, like the Gatling gun, the infernal devices used to harm them.
It's always been my understanding that a lot of our medical advances have come out of wars.
Mhm.
You know, I understand dialysis really came out of the Vietnam War. You know, I think a lot of our bypass and arterial surgeries and stuff all came out of that time. So,
Yeah, I think it was the innovations were a result of the doctors trying to catch up with technology.
yeah, I think and I'm not having any knowledge of it. I'm guessing like anything, it's like, what the hell do I have to lose here? You know, if I don't try this, they're either going to lose the limb or die. But maybe if I try this, maybe it'll work. And then we've
It's
got
also what they had to work with, because,
Yes.
you know, so many times if you're in a mobile army unit and you're, you know, a few hundred feet from the front line, you may not have all of the equipment, but you may be able to be creative enough to come up with different ways of doing things.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the innovations out of the Civil War, of course, was the fact that with all the general hospitals that were established, a lot of the surgeons working in the general hospitals were able to start to specialize in different types of medicine. You had neurology and the big one, and I just read a book on this, was reconstructive or what they call plastic surgery. I just read a book called The Facemaker about a surgeon in World War I who advanced the whole idea of reconstructive surgery during World War I as a result of all of the horrible wounds he was seeing from that war. But it did have its start, reconstructive surgery, in the Civil War. So,
Plastic operations.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and it was kind of interesting. It breaks down to the things like they realized if you used tiny stitches, you lessened the issue of large scars. I mean, little things all the way down the line.
And what they were even using for stitches at that time. You know, I mean,
horsehair.
Yeah, having to rely on horsehair when there was nothing else around. I mean, you know, it's a terrifying thought, but that was being creative and someone probably was saved because of that.
And actually the horsehair was actually, unbeknownst to the folks that were using the horsehair, that was safer to use than the silk they were using, because what they had to do is, prior to using the horsehair, in order to make it more malleable, they had to boil it. And when they're boiling it, they're disinfecting it.
Right.
So they were using disinfected horsehair for surgery rather than the silk, which would not been disinfected.
That's really interesting.
It really is.
Yeah, that was something I think too that came out probably closer to the end of the war was, you know, the fact that Pasteur and his ideas were finally coming forth, and Lister, where the idea of cleanliness was not something in the beginning of the war, especially, that was really no one paid any attention to that. They didn't really think about it. And You know, I mean, there are stories at that time of, not even during the war, but where, you know, where physicians would be treating someone who had some kind of god-awful disease and then go in and deliver a baby without even washing their hands. And I think by the end of the war, there was a little more knowledge about just hand washing, or not necessarily sanitizing, but at least trying to keep things a little cleaner. And I do think that that was where the women and the nurses made the biggest difference. You know, I mean, that still to me is one of those things that just is so befuddling. How could you not want these women who wanted to clean up after you come and help? I mean,
It took quite a while though for that become publicly accepted though, because when Garfield was shot, they attribute his deaths to the fact that his doctors just went into the wound over and over and over again with their fingers.
yeah.
And there were female physicians there and female nurses saying, no, 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 you need to, sanitize, you need to sanitize. And the doctors, of course, being males, knew more than they did, and just pushed it aside. But there is no doubt, I mean, the man lingered 4 months after he was shot. And during that time, it kept the same thing over and over. So you're talking the end of the Civil War to when he was assassinated in the late 1880s. It took quite a long time for this to be accepted by the American medical community.
You're right,
Yeah,
though.
for sure.
So it keeps coming up that it was the women like Florence Nightingale, years before. When she got to the Crimea, she was like, clean this mess up. And I mean, the women tended to really be pro ventilation and pro cleanliness, and they didn't have a scientific link, but they were right.
And you had organizations, civilian organizations like the United States Sanitary Commission, that would go in and say to the military, hey, you're not enforcing the rules about cleanliness. Well, we're just going to have to come in here and take care of it on our own. And they're the ones that were, trying to push the soldiers to, hey, you really need to wash your face and hands at least. And, here you need to change your clothes, or here have clean socks or whatever.
And then you had Dragon Dix, who was really trying to take over every aspect of that whole institution. And I mean, she was good at it. She was a force of nature, but she did manage to convince a lot of people that just, open the windows, keep things clean, wash the bedding, just simple things, that we take for granted because we have advanced that much.
She was a dragon apparently, but boy, did she get a lot of wheels turning in mental health.
Oh yeah, yeah. St. Elizabeth has, has its place to thank her for.
For sure. All right, looks like we're coming up on 8 o'clock. Do we have Carol, do you have any last things to say before we say goodnight?
You guys have made me feel that something I've been thinking about for a long time is something I should think about more. The series I'm working on is 4 parts. It's 4 one-hour programs. And actually, that was why I got an offer to write the book based on what I was doing with my scripts. So that came first. The book came second. So, and interesting, I mean, we were in production when COVID hit, and all the studios and the foundation that's grant funded were, everybody shut down. And then I got an offer to write the book, and I thought, oh, serendipity or something. But so anyway, I always thought I wanted a 5th part, but like everything in my 4 parts, it's all from primary source materials. It's all quotations from actually 80 couple different people, and a narrator strings the story together. So these are, their words, Dr. Letterman, Mary Walker, whomever. But I thought it would be so interesting to have a 5th hour where contemporary historians, doctors, scientists discuss the kinds of things you're bringing up that PTSD. Okay, are we dealing with it now? I mean, what's the, I think maybe that's something that should be more strongly considered. And maybe I could get all of you in another meeting. Suggestions, because you really gave me some juice. It's hard when you do something like that and it's so solitary. I mean, filmmaking, you're working with other people. You're really a link in the chain. But when you write a book, if you guys have done, you're on your own pretty much. And so you don't know as you're going along what the response is, but I'm so thrilled with the fact that you were interested. And that you actually read it, and that it makes people think and question. And I'm really grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for taking the time to speak with us, and thank you for this great book. And we will continue to carry it in our museum bookstore, and hopefully, open other people's eyes to what a great movie, what a great book it is. Cindy has one last thing. I see her raising her hand real quick.
Yes, when you were bringing up PTSD, you should research Brianna Scurry's her voyage through. She was one of the soccer players that got knocked in the head, and I heard her speak at an event where I worked, and she has an amazing story on PTSD and what worked and what didn't work for her. So use that as a reference point.
Thank you. I just wrote that down. And if any of you want to, comment, or you can reach me. I'm on Twitter X as Civil War RX, and I'm on LinkedIn under my name, Carol Adrienne. So feel free to chime in. I would love to hear your thoughts. And this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. And before we leave, I want to make sure everybody knows the next book we're going to be talking about is Black Antietam by Emily Ampt. And Emily will be joining us for a discussion of that. It's a skinnier book. So you can wait until the last minute to read it if you want to, but even though it's not as thick as this, it's still a good book to read. It'll give you some point of view about African Americans during the Battle of Antietam, which is a little covered subject.
Yeah.
But thank you again, Carol. Appreciate it so much, and thank you all for joining us.
I'll be speaking at President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington on
Oh!
August 13th. I'll be speaking about Civil War medicine in Washington, D.C. So
What
if you're
nice.
interested,
How
please,
interesting.
What's the date?
August 13th.
Okay.
Yeah, President Lincoln's Cottage is a great site.
I'm signed up for it.
Awesome. Thanks,
Yay!
Cindy.
All right.
I hope you all will touch base, and thank you so much. You really gave me so much tonight.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody. And I hope everybody stays cool in the upcoming weeks, and take care. And we'll see you all next time with Emily Ampt.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.